Malaysia has rivers. Singapore doesn't. And yet, for decades, Johor has needed Singapore's water to survive. Now, Malaysia wants out, and the consequences could reshape Southeast Asia. It's one of Southeast Asia's strangest paradoxes. Johor, a Malaysian state overflowing with rivers and rainfall, has long depended on Singapore, a tiny island city-state with no natural water sources, just to meet its demand for clean, treated water. Think about that for a moment. A state 6 times larger than Singapore, blessed with monsoons and rivers, relying on an island that has to recycle sewage and desalinate seawater just to survive. It sounds upside down, but that's the reality. The irony is striking. Johor has the raw water, but Singapore built the expertise, the infrastructure, and the technology to turn it into something usable at scale. For decades, this imbalance shaped the relationship between the two neighbors. Johor provided the raw material. Singapore provided the finished product. But dependence is never comfortable. Because when your survival hinges on your neighbor, you've also given them leverage. For Johor, that meant living with the knowledge that its water security, one of the most basic foundations of modern life, right, was tied to Singapore. And over time, water stopped being just a resource. It became politics. It became bargaining power. It became one of the most sensitive flashpoints in Malaysia-Singapore relations. But to understand how this uneasy dependence began and why it still matters today, we need to go back almost 100 years to the very first water agreements between Johor and Singapore. The story of Singapore's water dependence doesn't begin in modern times. It stretches back nearly a century. As early as 1927, when Singapore was still a British colony, it signed its very first water agreement with Johor. Even then, the island's lack of natural water resources was clear, and so it relied on its neighbor to survive. But the real turning point came in the 1960s. 2 agreements, one in 1961 and another in 1962, would go on to define Malaysia-Singapore relations for decades. The 1962 agreement in particular was the most critical. Under it, Singapore secured the right to draw up to 250 million gallons of raw water every single day from the Johor River at the incredibly low price of just 3 sen per 1,000 gallons. In exchange, Singapore agreed to supply Johor with treated water, up to 2% of what it drew, at 50 sen per 1,000 gallons. That arrangement was designed to last 99 years. Which means, unless something dramatic changes, it will only expire in 2061. At the time, this made sense. Johor had water, but lacked the facilities to process it. Singapore had the engineers, the money, and the political will to build the plants that could. For both sides, it looked like a win-win. But just 3 years later, everything changed. In 1965, Singapore was suddenly thrust into independence, separated from Malaysia almost overnight. For a small island with no rivers, no hinterland, and no secure water supply of its own, the agreements with Johor weren't just useful anymore. They were a matter of survival. The stakes were brutally clear. If Malaysia decided to cut off the water, Singapore could collapse. For a brand new nation barely finding its footing, this was an existential threat. And Singapore knew it. That's why, as part of the 1965 separation agreement, the very document that guaranteed its independence, Singapore insisted that the water agreements be written in as a binding legal guarantee. They weren't just bilateral contracts anymore. They were enshrined in Malaysia's own constitution and even registered with the United Nations. In other words, Singapore made sure that water, its most fragile lifeline, was protected under international law. It was a clever move, and it gave Singapore legal security. But it didn't eliminate the political risks. On paper, Malaysia's zero-dependency project sounds decisive. Build the reservoirs, switch on the plants, and Johor cuts the cord with Singapore. But reality is rarely that simple. The first problem is time. Reservoirs are not built overnight. Experts say it can take up to 8 years for one to be fully completed. Yet Malaysia's plan gives itself just 5. That's not a schedule. That's a race against physics. The second problem is politics. Malaysia's governments change often, sometimes in less than a year. And every new administration comes with its own set of priorities. Today, water independence may be a national project. Tomorrow, it could be pushed aside for something else. We've seen this before. Major infrastructure plans delayed, derailed, or canceled entirely because the political winds shifted. Then there's the issue of demand. Even if Malaysia pulls this off, Johor's industries are growing so quickly that the state could find itself short on water again within a decade. Data centers, semiconductor fabs, and manufacturing plants all consume staggering amounts of water. Independence from Singapore doesn't automatically solve that. It may only buy time. Finally, there's the question of resilience. What happens when drought hits, or when pollution forces local plants to shut down? In those moments, Johor has always had one fallback: treated water from Singapore. Cutting that off completely might win political points, but it removes an important safety net. So while the Zero Dependency Project is framed as bold and historic, it's also risky. It bets on perfect construction timelines, flawless political will, and steady demand growth that never overwhelms supply. And that's why some critics warn, Johor may succeed in building independence on paper, only to find itself still vulnerable in practice. Which raises the bigger question: if Malaysia does achieve water independence, what happens to Singapore? Singapore has never been comfortable with dependence. From the day it was forced into independence in 1965, its leaders understood a hard truth: if Malaysia ever shut off the taps, Singapore could collapse. And so, for decades, Singapore has quietly prepared for that scenario. The strategy is known as the Four National Taps. It's Singapore's master plan for water security. The first tap is local catchment, rainwater collected in reservoirs that cover nearly 2/3 of the island. The second is imported water from Malaysia. The third is desalination, turning seawater into drinking water. And the fourth, perhaps the most famous, is Nuator, ultra-clean recycled water made from treated wastewater. It's a multi-layered system designed so that no single source can ever be held hostage. And it's been working. Today, Singapore can already meet up to 40% of its water needs through Nuator alone. Desalination adds another 30%. By 2060, Singapore aims to meet 85% of its needs independently. In other words, long before the 1962 water agreement expires in 2061, Singapore expects to be self-sufficient. But there's something else here. Singapore has not only planned for survival, it has turned water into a form of strength. By investing in desalination plants, high-tech recycling, and sprawling reservoirs, it built credibility as one of the world's most advanced water economies. What started as a vulnerability has become a showcase of national resilience. So while Malaysia frames the Zero Dependency Project as liberation, Singapore doesn't look cornered. If anything, it looks prepared. Because in a sense, Singapore has always acted as though one day Malaysia might walk away. And that raises the bigger question: when that day finally comes, what will the balance of power look like between the two neighbors? If Malaysia really achieves water independence, it would close one of the longest-running chapters of vulnerability in Southeast Asia. For decades, the taps that crossed the Johor Strait symbolized more than just water. They symbolized leverage and sometimes quiet resentment. For Malaysia, ending reliance on Singapore would be more than just a technical achievement. It would be political theater. Leaders in Johor could stand before their people and say, "We are no longer dependent. We have control. In a region where sovereignty is fiercely guarded, that matters." But independence comes with its own price. Because once the pipes are cut, cooperation becomes optional. And when cooperation fades, so does trust. Without that daily exchange of water, the two neighbors risk drifting further apart, each turning inward, each protecting their own resources first. For Singapore, the end of the 1962 agreement would close a painful memory, the era when its survival depended on someone else. In truth, Singapore may welcome that moment. Its desalination plants and Nuator technology are already enough to secure its future. By then, Singapore could even flip the equation, not just surviving without Malaysia's water, but exporting its technology to the world. And that's where the story becomes bigger than just two countries. Because water scarcity is not a Malaysian or Singaporean problem. It's a global one. From California to Cape Town, from India to the Middle East, water security is becoming the defining crisis of the 21st century. How Malaysia and Singapore navigate their final water divorce may set an example far beyond their shores. So maybe the real question isn't whether Malaysia can go it alone or whether Singapore will thrive without imports. The real question is this: In a world where water is power, who will turn survival into strength? And who will be left thirsty?